Hi guys, in this video we're going to smash through the League of Nations and appeasement, looking at all of the successes, all of the failures of the League, and also how appeasement contributed to the start of the Second World War. Let's jump right in.
The League of Nations was an intergovernmental organisation designed to improve international cooperation and prevent further wars. It was proposed by President Wilson of the US at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Wilson wanted to create his own league based on his own 14 points as part of his dream for a new world order. These 14 points were essentially the principles for peace negotiations that Wilson wanted to use following the end of World War I. And from this, the League was created in 1920. The primary aims of the League were to stop wars from happening in the future where possible, encourage disarmament of nations, and improve global living conditions, in particular paying attention to refugees, disease, and working conditions across the world. By the 1930s, there were 58 nations who were members of the League. However, most historians agree the League of Nations was overall a failure. It was overly ambitious in some of its aims. It was also missing some major powers at the start of its formation in 1920. Germany did not join until 1926. The USSR did not join until 1934. And ironically, despite Wilson proposing the idea in the first place, the USA never became a member of the League of Nations. The League also failed as there was no army to enforce any of its peace negotiations. As a result of this, the League only had a limited impact in solving disputes between countries. And on top of this, all decisions in the League of Nations had to be unanimous. This means every country in the League had to vote in favour of a decision for it to go ahead. This made the League slow to respond to international crises. Let's begin by looking at the 1920s for the League of Nations. The 1920s saw some limited successes for the League. World War I had displaced millions of people across Europe, causing a major refugee crisis for the League to solve. They did rehome many displaced people, including 500,000 prisoners of war from World War I. They're also credited with helping many Turkish refugees after the end of the war, and they attacked the slave trading problem that was happening at the time. Despite having no army, they also did have some success over border disputes. One famous example was the Sweden-Finland debate over the Åland Islands. The League confirmed that Finland had sovereignty over these islands, and Sweden, despite some major protests at the time, agreed to these terms. There was also a shooting incident on the border between Greece and Bulgaria, and the League intervened in this successfully. They ordered a ceasefire between the two sides and forced Greece to pay compensation to Bulgaria. However, the League was very inconsistent in its approach to border disputes. This became evident in 1923 during Mussolini's invasion of Corfu. When Italy invaded Corfu in 1923, their leader Mussolini was criticised by the League for doing this. However, League members Britain and France let Mussolini resolve this problem outside of the League. And so this raised the question, why does the League of Nations only intervene in certain crises and not others? Well, as we'll explore next, we'll see a lot of this is to do with appeasement and fear of these powerful nations like Italy and also, of course, Germany. So now we get into the 1930s, which was seen as a monumental failure for the League of Nations. This was mainly due to two reasons. Firstly, the role of aggressive nations like Germany and Italy in overpowering the League, and the appeasement policies of Britain and France. Appeasement is essentially making concessions to an aggressive foreign power in order to avoid the risk of war breaking out. And we have three key examples of this that we're going to revise today. Firstly, Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1932. Secondly, Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. And lastly, Germany's remilitarisation of the Rhineland in 1936. Let's jump into these now. Let's start with Japan and Manchuria. By March 1932, the Japanese army had invaded the Chinese territory of Manchuria. This was a way for Japan to take land and resources following their own economic depression at the time. This also came at a time when the Chinese army was weakening and Japan's army was strengthening, so Japan fancied their chances. You'd think this is where the League would intervene, but they were reluctant to act in this situation. Part of this was geographical. The League mostly concerned itself with European affairs, rather than affairs happening in Asia. However, there were other crucial factors too. Japan was a member of the League of Nations, and a very powerful one in fact, which helped their cause in this situation. And many of the Western nations maybe did not think that Japan invading China and attacking the communists in the country would not be a bad thing for the interests of the Western world. And so, due to these factors, the League failed to impose any economic or military sanctions on Japan. The League has since faced criticism for being slow to react in this situation. Japan eventually left the League and continued to occupy Manchuria. This set a precedent for their full-scale invasion of China in 1937. And so, the invasion of Manchuria is a great example to use in your exams when you're discussing the League being indecisive and slow to react, and powerful nations getting away with aggressive moves in foreign policy. Next, we have Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. This was when Italy invaded the independent African state of Abyssinia. Britain and France, who were both members of the League, failed to take any action against Mussolini for doing this. This was because Britain and France were worried that Germany was rearming. They were scared of war breaking out, and so they wanted to keep Mussolini on side in case of German aggression. The armies of Britain and France were weak following the Great Depression, so it was crucial they had as much military power behind them as possible, which was why keeping Italy and Mussolini on side was so important. So Britain and France went behind the League's back and made secret negotiations with Italy, giving them 2/3 of Abyssinia. This was a key example of the appeasement policies of Britain and France in the 1930s. And it also shows the failure of the League to deal with these aggressive dictators. This was a crucial reason for tension building in Europe in the 1930s and the outbreak of World War II. Lastly, we have Germany's remilitarisation of the Rhineland in 1936. The Rhineland was a strip of land inside Germany, bordering France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Germany was forced to demilitarise this area under the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This was resented by the German public and Hitler. In 1936, Hitler remilitarised the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. This massively increased tensions in Europe, as the Rhineland had huge economic and military importance, serving as a natural barrier to invasions. However, again, the League failed. They let Hitler station his troops here, and this just prompted more aggression from Hitler, for example, his occupation of Austria in March 1938. Now, let's go through those key phrases to use in your exam for a top-band answer when discussing the League of Nations and appeasement. The League of Nations had limited success due to aggressive nations such as Germany and Italy overpowering the League, and the appeasement policies of Britain and France. The League was undermined due to its lack of authority in dealing with international conflict. The League had no military to strike back against aggressive foreign policy moves, while the League was often divided on issues, as votes had to be unanimous, causing the organisation to be slow in responding to crises. The League failing to stop dictators from taking aggressive action in Europe was a crucial reason for the increase in international tension in the 1930s and the outbreak of World War II. Their lack of decisive action and the appeasement policies of Britain and France meant that Hitler and Mussolini were allowed to install aggressive foreign policy without consequence, encouraging further aggressive, expansionist policies, leading to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. And now we can finish this topic off by going through some common exam questions on the League of Nations and appeasement. A short question might be, describe two successes of the League of Nations in the 1920s. So for this question, go back to my slide on the 1920s and look at refugees and border disputes. We spoke about prisoners of war, Turkish refugees, slave traders, and then the border disputes like the Islands and the war between Greece and Bulgaria. You can talk about any of these for that question. A longer question might be, explain why there was tension in Europe in the 1930s. So this question is all about the appeasement policies of Britain and France and the failure of the League to deal with international conflicts in the 1930s. And we went through some great examples of this today. Next, the League of Nations completely failed to achieve its aims. How far do you agree? There's a few different angles you can take to this. Firstly, you can separate the 1920s from the 1930s because there were some limited successes in the 20s. However, over time, it became clear to everybody the League was failing to achieve its aims. You could also bring into this the argument that the League of Nations was bound to fail and that World War II was unavoidable. Hitler and Mussolini were extremely aggressive and determined to expand their territories. Perhaps this expansion was inevitable, and the League of Nations cannot be considered as responsible for stopping this, especially considering they had no army to enforce the decisions they made. A final question might be, the main reason why the League of Nations failed was because of how it was organised. How far do you agree? For this question, you can split your answer into 3 paragraphs. Firstly, the League of Nations being organised or disorganised. Secondly, the appeasement policies of Britain and France and how this failed the League. And thirdly, the aggressive foreign policy moves of Hitler and Mussolini. This brings us to the end of the topic of the League of Nations and appeasement. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.